Although the Vietnam War can be considered the pinnacle of pain for the effects and damage done by protectionism, it is not the first example of a vile effort to pervert the power of the United States to protect certain individuals and organizations. Prohibition was instituted through governmental regulation to protect the American public from the ravages of alcohol in the 1920s. The nobleness of the cause did not justify or amplify the laws that were passed to eliminate the wickedness of drinking. After a decade of social warfare, corruption, and bloodshed, protectionism through prohibition was declared to be a failure and abandoned. The large regulatory bureaucracy that oversaw prohibition was now out of work, power, and money. Desperate, defeated government lifers learned a lesson through the principle that we teach by example and learn by experience. Alcohol was simply too popular, too profitable, and too deeply embedded into the American culture for it to be criminalized. Protectionism generates willful ignorance and selfish greed to survive, enable plunder, and allow selective persecution, fabrication of a threat, or creation of a crisis requires that the victim or target of a protectionist wrath must be demonized, exaggerated, and made into an evil empire. Unpopular beliefs, foreign cultural customs, and minority races or religions are the perfect villains for a power-mongering politician to protect his vulnerable flock and gullible constituents from. After the repeal of prohibition, a newly unemployed and powerless Harry J. Anslinger began to lobby and influence congressmen or any other official who might be of use or was sympathetic to his cause. Using lies and misinformation, Anslinger crafted and created a fictional, imaginary, demonic menace that the American public needed to be protected from. Decades of injustice, imprisonment, and cruelty were about to be endured by free Americans in order to fulfill one man's desire to maintain his status and power in Washington. Anslinger identified and vilified marijuana as the greatest threat to our society since World War I. Marijuana was demonized as a menace because it was primarily used and enjoyed by the brown menace. The inference was that if American youth were not protected against marijuana, then racial boundaries would disappear and a generation would be lost to foreign cultures and customs. An ignorant, twisted rationale that we had to imprison our youth in order to save them became the political mantra that replaced rational thinking and truthful research. Marijuana was not on the radar or even heard of by most Americans at that time. There were no laws or restrictions against its use, possession, or sale. Prior to Anslinger's crusade, the campaign to criminalize marijuana incorporated racial stereotypes and ethnic distrust to persuade and convince Congress of the supposedly grave danger that marijuana posed to our country. With the use of fear-mongering and driven by his lust for power, Anslinger was able to coerce and intimidate our elected representatives to outlaw marijuana. When marijuana became illegal for the very first time in our nation's history, a new regulatory agency to enforce that law became a requirement for the protection of the American public. The perfect candidate to lead this new bureaucracy was, of course, Harry J. Anslinger. The cancerous cycle of protectionism was now complete. Invent a threat or create a crisis, and then spend vast amounts of public dollars to enthrone tyrants that pledge to protect us. The criminalizing of marijuana through protectionism has lasted several lifetimes and ruined countless ordinary lives and families, all the while enriching politicians and public servants with power and profit. Millions of young men and women have been prosecuted and imprisoned just so that one man could have an easy government job with power and influence. The next blatant example of protectionism was the Senate hearings by Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. With his alcoholism raging out of control and threatening his career, McCarthy had to come up with a new profile or public image. Communism and socialism were the low-hanging fruit that he would soon blow up into a super powerful threat to the American way of life. Following the protectionism formula or playbook, McCarthy used Senate hearings to publicly manipulate the free press and public opinion. By vociferously condemning and greatly magnifying the threat of communism and socialism, McCarthy created hysteria, panic, and fear. Because McCarthy could not subpoena socialist Russia or communist China to testify, he needed a name or face to be the target of his modern-day Spanish Inquisition. Once again, innocent lives and ordinary people were about to be publicly crucified and tormented for their personal beliefs. McCarthy subpoenaed actors, writers, and various entertainment personalities to appear and be publicly harangued and humiliated in the halls of Congress. Careers were destroyed and reputations trashed so that one man could have power, glory, and publicity. McCarthy's reign of terror, cruelty, and ignorance only lasted about 2 years before responsibility and sanity finally returned to the Senate. But the damage is already done. Although McCarthy's time in the spotlight was short and faded rapidly, his actions had lasting impact. The CIA paid close attention to McCarthy's methods and they began to fan the flames of hysteria about communism and socialism. The malleability and transformation of protectionism from prohibition to marijuana to communism alerted all aspiring powermongers that protectionism was a game-changing playbook and surefire formula for acquiring political power and profit. These early formative years for protectionism were like undetected cancer, slowly weakening and sickening our free society without setting off alarms or causing concern. While we effortlessly denounce and curse communism and socialism, Frederick Bastiat's warnings about the poison and lethality of protectionism have been undiscovered and ignored. The power and evilness of protectionism is progressive and ultimately fatal to a free society and country. Proof of the disease and decay of protectionism is the public murder of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. If politicians warped by power, greed, and cruelty can use the cover of protectionism to kill the President of the United States and cover it up, then anything and everything previously condemned to hell can now escape and wreak destruction and desolation on our country and citizens.